President McHenry strode into the room with his usual full stride. His long legs carried him quickly to his chair at the head of the conference table. There were only a dozen others in the room, a few aides, the NSA and CIA chiefs, a handful of generals, and one Marine sergeant who looked and felt totally out of place. The president threw a small set of papers on the table surface and sat down with a great sigh. As the others had sat, except for the sergeant, who seemed to want to melt into the walls. McHenry shoved the papers into the middle of the table and looked around the room. "What the hell is this?" he said in a voice that expected answers and would allow for no excuses. On the table was something which styled itself a newspaper, but which was simply a few sheets of normal-sized paper stapled together in the corner. It called itself The Soldier's Heart, and had appeared on several hundred military installations worldwide, almost all the same day. It did not appear in places where officers would see it, but only where NCOs, sergeants, and naval chiefs, and all the enlisted ranks would find it. It appeared first in small numbers, but in less than a week it had been photocopied many times, and a few there were in the American military ranks who had not used it. On some installations, the commanders had tried to confiscate all the copies, and not a few soldiers had been put into the stockade for possessing one. Worse, its existence had made it into the mainstream press, and there was uproar everywhere because of what it had advocated. This meeting was supposed to be able to tell the president where it came from and what the Joint Chiefs of Staff were going to do about it. Unfortunately, the meeting would end with more questions than answers. McHenry looked around the room, daring someone to speak and say something meaningful, something that made sense. On his desk, back in the Oval Office, were emergency presidential chairs awaiting to be signed, declaring martial law in over a dozen major American citizens and assigning various military units to peacekeeping operations within them. Thus, a dozen major American cities were now being invaded by martial law. Now, on the table in front of him was nothing less than the threat of revolt among the enlisted and NCO Corps of the U.S. Army, and perhaps the other services as well. For years, minority men and women had found a place for themselves within the profession of modern warrior life, so that large proportions of NCOs, naval chiefs, and other essential career servicemen and women were black and Hispanic. Somehow, these people had formed some kind of association, some kind of private group, and were essentially announcing that they would not go into American cities and turn their guns on the members of their own races. The magazine, or whatever you wanted to call it, The Soldier's Heart, not only had editorials explicitly urging refusal to follow such orders, but outlining in detail the legal ramifications of claiming that such soldiers were in violation of all those legal and extra-legal principles that not only gave a soldier the right to refuse an illegal order, but essentially demanded that such an order not be obeyed. The cities were burning, and the American city was nearly in revolt. Finally, General Archer, Chief of Staff of the Army, ventured to speak to answer the President's questions.
"We're close to knowing who did this. Several arrests have been made. Sergeant Morrison here,"
nodding towards the CO, trying to disappear into the wall.
"He knows some of how this was done. Our more difficult problem is evaluating what's going to happen next. Our psych people tell us that this is possibly a real disaster. Continental U.S. units are clearly confused over the moral issue, and unit morale is already falling. Worse, overseas units who won't be directly affected are suffering the same problems. We looked into whether a foreign government did this or some kind of psychological warfare. But there is no evidence of this.
The rest of the Army people nodded, as well as the inside.
The officer corps seems mostly affected, but they're unaffected. That is, but there are indications that this is a problem for them as well. Not so much following the chain of command and going into the cities, but with regard to handling their troops. The feedback they are getting is that following orders will be a problem. Some whole units may be sent in and then desert, taking their material and weapons with them. My best people don't think this is organized in an effort to take over anything. Rather, it's just what it appears to be. The Army doesn't want to fight against its own people, plain and simple.
McHenry visibly slumped. This could not be happening to him. A life spent knowing kissing babies and asses, and now this. The whole country going down the tubes, the markets crashing, the banks failing, the cities burning, and the American Army is now refusing to follow orders. The most powerful man in the world was almost there, almost ready to see how little people he really had. But not quite, as his next angry outburst shows.
I want these people shot,
he yelled, trying to shake off his medication-induced mood swings.
This is treason, this is mutiny, this is wartime. I'll sign the executive order. If soldiers won't follow orders, I want them tried and shot.
The room got very silent. No one could think of what to say. When the president's breathing slowed and the flush started to recede from his face, General Archer went on.
Well, during our investigations, this man appeared one day. You can see how nervous he is. He wasn't expecting to appear in the room. He is on leave and came to the Pentagon and sought out our investigating teams by name. He had some inside source and said the right words and knew the right names. He also says he is expendable. He is ready to die. But that's not the strange part. I'll let him speak for himself. You are not going to believe this. Sergeant, front and center and lay it out for everyone.
Archer smiled. He wanted to see the faces while this low-ranking idiot tried his spiel on real soldiers, real prayers. Chief Master Sergeant Eric Morrison whipped the sweat off his palms onto his uniform trousers. He was nervous, all right, but not so much from fear of consequences. This was a crucial moment, and one that might make or break everything. These guys would either laugh out loud, as Sergeant Archer seemed to expect, or they might just realize what real hope there might be. He didn't know, and he didn't like so much depending upon this. It was crazy, and it was his idea, and the group said, okay, it's your idea, you do it. He moved towards the table, near a corner, facing the president, and took an at-ease kind of brace. Feet 18 inches apart, hands behind his back, as if he was delivering some messages to officers he was familiar with. He even tried the old trick of imagining everyone was naked, but in a room with this much power in it, it just didn't work. He tried to concentrate, for he was close to throwing up because of his nerves. Even in combat, he had never been this frightened.